As the impact of the First World War diminished, the once fledgling automobile industry blossomed and grew as it had never grown before. Literally hundreds of new manufacturers came upon the scene, and they started to build cars which ranged from stately to stolid, and from racy to rugged, despite the post-war slump and an approaching depression. As a result of this, a great many of those manufacturers would disappear in a very few short years. The name of the game at this time was marketing, and the answer for anyone to stay in business was to sell, sell, sell. By the early 20s, the two most established names on the American motoring scene were General Motors and Ford, but they were soon to be joined by a third name, Chrysler. Walter P. Chrysler had been involved in the industry since early in the century, but it wasn't until 1925 that he started a company in his own name. This is the Chrysler 77, and it's an extremely good car. And bearing in mind Chrysler's philosophy of providing performance and reliability, it's neither complex to drive nor to maintain. And if it was sometimes a bit tricky on rough roads, it didn't really matter too much, as America was already well advanced in road building. In only a few years, Chrysler took his company into third and then second in the marketplace. So by the end of the 1920s, the American motor industry was already dominated by the big three, GM, Ford and Chrysler. In 1919, child Harold Wills finally parted company with Henry Ford, carrying with him a pay severance cheque for just a little over $1.5 million. They'd been together since 1902, huddled together in primitive workshop conditions when they couldn't afford heating, racing together for fun and for promotion, and finally building the Model T together. But even as early as 1912, Harold Wills was dissatisfied with the technological development of the Model T and tried to convince old Henry to build something better. But old Henry was as stubborn as a mule. He wouldn't budge. And finally, after another 7 years, Wills had had too much. He left with his paycheck to build a car of his own. This, the Wills St. Clair, the second part of the name coming from the beautiful Lakes district in which it was built. The Wills St. Clair was innovative, technologically brilliant, and a very impressive failure. The single most impressive feature of the Wills St. Clair was its engine, a V8 with single overhead camshafts, based on concepts introduced by Marque with Hispano-Suiza and adapted by Wills for use in the United States. It also featured a very advanced cooling system called thermosiphon, and now quite common practice, and a thermostatically controlled cooling fan which cut out above 40 miles per hour. Not common practice today, and yet it ought to be. Modern manufacturers take note. Other small features, like this little courtesy light for overtaking, which came on when the headlights were dim to give an idea of passing distances and overtaking distances, that is, between the two vehicles alongside one another. Actually, it's just riddled with marvellous ideas and an extremely high quality design throughout, and in fact therein lies one of the problems. There were about 10 major manufacturers in the USA at this time, all of them capable of doing at least one of two things: either establishing a very good servicing network right across the country, or alternatively building a car so simple that it was possible for the average backyard mechanic to fix it. Sadly, Wills was unable to do either, and so concerned was he with the idea of getting his own precious ideas on the market that he forgot to think about that, and the car ultimately failed. In Europe, things were very different. Instead of a few companies manufacturing vast numbers of cars, the emphasis was more on many companies turning out comparatively small numbers of cars. Cars whose concepts were reflecting or catching up on what the United States had done during the war. This Excelsior Albert Premier was Belgium's answer to the luxury car market. And it's interesting to note that, top of the range or not, European cars of the 20s were still being built to contend with considerably less than top quality roads. Or perhaps no roads at all. There are those who considered the Excelsior Albert Premier to be an equivalent with Hispano-Suiza and Rolls-Royce, but it isn't in reality. Well engineered though it may be, it's big and cumbersome and brutish and somewhat dull. Many European countries were still manufacturing for the luxury car market. Despite the post-war slump and the approaching depression, some car makers could still afford to be exclusive. But most car manufacturers of the period were building cars exactly like this, the Clino. Introduced in 1922, it was aimed directly right at the bottom of the market. So much so, in fact, that its price was tied to that of the Bullnose Morris. Initially, Clino's pricing policy was a great success in that it made them the number 3 seller in the United Kingdom. But ultimately, the policy was doomed to failure, as Clino couldn't cost their models in advance, which of course meant economic disaster. By the end of the decade, they were gone. Like Harold Wills and unlike Walter P. Chrysler, another failure for marketing. The Clino didn't deserve to die. Basically, it was a good little car. If it was still around today, they may have been able to avoid the Leyland grab, and England might still have produced at least one good small car. At this stage, very few people in Europe understood the technique of marketing cars, with the result that those who did tended to make a killing. One of these was André Citroën, who produced this, his first car, in 1919, and set the trend for innovation, which was to become the hallmark of his company's products ever since. That insignia, incidentally, came from a design for a gear wheel that André himself produced. What Citroën did was to offer a fully furnished product, complete with hood, spare wheel and all accessories, while most of the others provided nothing that wasn't specially ordered by the customer. The A, for example, had headlights and a self-starter, and it also came in 5 body styles, from a tourer through a coupe to a delivery van. Within a fortnight of the first car coming off the production line, 16,000 orders had been taken from people who'd never even seen it. Of the full production run of 30,000, all were sold before they were built. Citroën had 50 of his cars at the Paris Motor Show to take people for joyrides. And in 1920, he renewed the entire Paris taxi fleet with this car. One of the difficulties with filming a series like this is that you are occasionally confronted with a sequence of events that makes it almost impossible for you to do your job. For example, we have available to us one of the world's very rare cars, and we've tried to film it 3 times. The first time it rained, the second time it poured, and the third time it just simply tipped buckets, meaning that we only really got just a few minutes to drive the car. In this case, another French car built by Gabriel Voisin, a very different sort of man from André Citroën, and one who had 3 great passions: the aeroplane, the motor car, and women, and not necessarily in that order, obviously. His cars were very highly regarded, and in fact they became the favourites of the then equivalent of the jet set. Rudolph Valentino had 2 of them, and other customers were H.G. Wells and Maurice Chevalier, and as well the President of the French Republic, Monsieur Mitterrand. Voisin was considered to be one of the true geniuses in the history of the car. The sleeve-valved engine of this model, a 1923 car, for example, achieved an efficiency only surpassed by Hispano-Suiza. Voisin insisted on lightweight bodies. He experimented successfully with streamlining and with power-assisted hydraulic brakes, and as well played around with spring rates and with vertical damping. And he absolutely refused to have anything to do with any sort of promotion or advertising involving his cars, which was anything other than the simply defined truth. No gloss, no glitter, just the facts. He was equally as straightforward with his customers. For example, let me read to you from the preface of the handbook for this very car. We have divided this book into 2 separate and distinct parts. The first, short and incomplete, will perhaps be read. The second, which is the result of an enormous amount of work, will doubtless never be perused. He goes on later on to describe his own clutch as being simply perfect. Our clutch is perfect, is the way he's written it. Strange man. In fact, his one great passion was aeroplanes. And one could understand that because he could afford to be a lot less tolerant with people who bought aeroplanes, especially when they were governments, and he built 10,000 of them for the war effort. Unfortunately, his cars did not survive the pressures of the 1930s. And looking at the cars of the 70s, that's a great pity because there should be more people like him around. In Italy, both Fiat and Bianchi were vying for the bottom end of the market, but they were still a bit behind the British and the French. But the characteristics were the same: small, light, well-engineered, and very unlike the cars of 10 years before. And at least one Italian manufacturer was ahead of the British and the French: Lancia. Vincenzo Lancia began building cars under his own name in 1907 after working for some time with Serrano and with Fiat, and for a while, in fact, racing Fiat's cars. His Lancias gave a whole new meaning to the Greek alphabet, with Lancia alphas and betas and gammas and deltas. And finally, in 1922, the Lancia Lambda. The Lambda at the time was unique. It was the first production car in the world to have independent front suspension and a unitary chassis body construction. That is, the chassis was so designed that all of its panels became stress members and were able to take parts of the body itself. It was an extremely successful and very good car, with its one super strong point being its steering and the remarkable feel afforded by its front suspension, which was in fact by helical coils and sliding pillars. Even by today's standards, the feel and accuracy in the steering of this 1927 Lambda is quite remarkable. The market for small cars skyrocketed at this time, due partly to the developing interest of people in the car generally, but also because of an intense price-cutting war that was going on by highly competitive manufacturers, which brought the car down to the price that everyone could afford. As a result of that, this new interest in the car brought about an awareness of its capacity for sport and for fun and recreation. That in turn gave a boost to motor racing. Perhaps the most famous racing name to emerge at this time was W.O. Bentley, one of the very few manufacturers to go motor racing and then have to build more ordinary cars for the public. This is a 3-litre Bentley which won at Le Mans, and I used to wonder why it might have been able to do so, but I don't wonder anymore. It is a fantastic car to drive. Despite the fact that Bentley went on to build bigger and better engines, the 3-litre is a very spirited car, which gives good performance right throughout the range, a good turn of speed around the 90 to 100 miles per hour mark, and an excellent gearbox and top brakes. But the point most in its favour is its quite incredible handling ability. Despite, by comparison with today's cars, relatively skinny tyres on little wire spoke wheels, it sticks to the road like glue. The problem with Bentleys is that not too many people could afford them, so firms like Alvis, Riley and Sunbeam launched small light sports cars, leading to the introduction of the most famous sports car marque of them all, MG. MG stood for Morris Garages, an organisation owned by Cecil Kimber, whose specialty was developing competition cars. This is not the first car to wear an MG badge, but it's considered to be the first true MG, as it is Kimber's first special-built complete package. It belonged to him, and he used it principally for trials, not for racing, as some people thought. And it's just as well, really, because it wasn't terribly fast. It was, however, highly manoeuvrable. It was also extremely cold and uncomfortable in these sort of wet conditions. In the same way as the big Bentleys gave rise to the small sports cars in England, the great racing Delages in France were giving a boost to such names as Amilcar, and in Italy, Fiat, OM and of course Alfa Romeo were making their bid for the sports car market. But the name that brings most instant response, and certainly the loveliest of all the 20s races, was the Type 35 Bugatti. There's something quite irresistible about a Bugatti, even though they're sometimes quite difficult to get into. A suggestion of superb style and grace. An image, in fact, that Ettore Bugatti himself was at great pains to preserve with his somewhat eccentric lifestyle. For example, he had boots designed with individual compartments for each toe. They were truly great cars, but they were never quite as faultless as legend would have us believe. There was, however, never a truly cheap Bugatti. There were 3 Type 35 Bugattis designated A, B and C. This is the C, 2 litres, 8 cylinders, supercharged, plenty of power, good brakes, 4-wheel mechanical, good gearbox, difficult to shift however, and really good steering but heavy. In fact, the whole car willful, thoroughbred, rather like the horses that Bugatti really loved. Bugatti found himself being ribbed over the years about only being able to build Grand Prix racing and sports cars. And so therefore he embarked upon a project to build a true luxury car and came up with the fantastic but unsuccessful Bugatti Royale. Fantastic because it was 12.7 litres in capacity, an 8-cylinder car, huge by any standards, quite luxurious, absolutely spectacular, but unsuccessful because they only made 7 of them. Inevitably, Bugatti went back to Grand Prix sports and racing cars. But it's not always the big cars that win motor races. In 1927, despite some formidable opposition, which included the now awesome name of Bugatti, the first Australian Grand Prix was won by a car very much like this one, an Austin 7. Australia also saw one of motoring's more epic journeys, with a journey made by the incredible Francis Birtles, who set out in October 1927 on his second attempt to drive from London to Canberra in Australia. The second attempt was successful, as it happens. Can you just imagine having to do this sort of thing to check the level of a couple of thousand creek crossings? Only 2 things looked like stopping Birtles. 1, 300 miles of Burmese jungle, which he eventually had to bypass by ship, and 2, the customs officers in Darwin who impounded his car and insisted that he pay duty on it. It took the intervention of the Prime Minister to get Birtles and his car out of Darwin and onto Canberra on the 15th of July 1928. Birtles was a man of iron. I never met him, but I know that because I've driven his car. It's a beast of a thing, and how he drove it halfway around the world, I'll never know. The gear shifter's down beside the left leg, and it has to be shifted by stretching for first and for third. The brakes, well, they practically don't work at all. And the springs, without shock absorbers, make the car bounce and jump and skip all over the place. You sit in a very uncomfortable little seat, which tends to rub at your back and your arms, and you bump your elbows every time you turn corners. Heaven knows how he stood it for the distance. As well as being a triumph for his doggedness and ingenuity, Birtles' journey was a triumph for the car itself. Not just for the being, but for the whole concept of the 1920s car. By this time, the car was a well-designed, well-engineered machine. based on proven principles and tested on everything from Birtles marathons to the high-speed racetracks of the world. It does not seem surprising to me that this was the generation which flowered a generation which would lead to the great cars of the 1930s. The 20s began with the Austin 7, progressed through a number of racing marques and ended with this, the Mercedes SS, surely the ultimate in brute power and sheer style.